Going on this computer. I'm now recording. So welcome everyone to European Christian Anarchist Community, and over to you, Alex.
Well, thanks for organising the online version of what would have happened in mid-July were it not for COVID and everything else. I'm in France at the in-laws, and therefore I apologize in advance if the 6-year-old or the 3-year-old do not obey authority and turn up and intervene. But yeah, that's just that. I thought, so originally when Scott asked me to come to the July original, you wanted me to do 2 sessions, one on the sort of foundations of Christian anarchist thought, and one potentially more on Tolstoy's political thought, in particular Tolstoy's arguments. And I was, I was going to do the first, but obviously I'm not anymore. Instead, I thought I'd talk a bit about Tolstoy. And so I have got some slides to help us, to help you out maybe and me follow the structure of what I'm doing. Anja, you all right? Yep, good. Yes, so that.
One sec.
Yeah, take your time.
Is this floating panel? That's it. Hide that. Slideshow. Come on.
It might, yeah.
Resume slideshow. That's it. There's your first. Is that the first one?
Yeah, perfect. You can pass to the next one, please. There are, I mean, yeah. There's perfect. There's I think there's about 8 slides, but it's mainly to summarize the main argument in each of the sort of steps of how I try and present Tolstoy's thoughts. So, okay, backtrack a bit. Last September, I published with an academic press, and therefore way too expensive, a book on Tolstoy's political thought. The hope is that maybe around Easter next year, when it's been 18 months since it was published, it might be made available as a paperback, cheaper, but it'll still probably be more expensive than I'd like. But one of the reasons I therefore wrote the next thing is precisely because this was too expensive. So I've also written a kind of shorter chapter, which is available open access, freely online. I think Angie posted the link to it on Facebook, at least I think I saw it.
Yeah.
That's part of a 3-volume collection that I've helped co-edit with my colleague and friend Matt Adams. But the chapter in there kind of does a quick summary version of what's in the book. So the book splits Tolstoy's thought into 5. His pacifism, his anarchism, his anti-clericalism, his asceticism, which allows me to cover his views on sex and marriage, his views on art, and his views on indulgences, if you will, and his vegetarianism, etc. That's not part of this shorter chapter. And then there's also his activism or his activist methods. And in the shorter chapter, I'm not going too much into his asceticism, but I'm still doing the main things that the book does, just with fewer quotes and shorter arguments, etc. And what I was proposing to do here is take you rather quickly through the main argument that's there, and we can, in discussion, expand a bit more on any of the bits of that. I hope that's all right with people if I do that. The faces I see are nodding, so I'll take it as a yes.
Yes.
Good. But I mean, there isn't a rigid structure to this. If people want to pause and discuss anything as we go along, I'm happy to, but it might maybe be easier if I kind of whiz through and then discuss later, whatever people prefer. I'm quite flexible. Now, what each of these chapters do in the book, or each of the passages in the shorter version, in each case, what I'm trying to do is I split it in 3, which is what you have on the slides there. So first, I try and summarize Tolstoy's claims, and so in the book, there's a lot of quoting of Tolstoy, where from all his corpus and letters, a lot of the books, etc., to really let his voice through. The shorter chapter does much less quoting, but it summarizes what he says. Then each time I try and reflect on some of the main criticisms that have been leveled at either Tolstoy directly or at the kind of views that Tolstoy proposed, all right? And I kind of respond to these or reflect on these criticisms. And then also again, each time, the third move is to sort of step back a bit and reflect on the relevance of all that for us today, because of course Tolstoy wrote a little while ago and with a particular purpose, and I'm trying to reflect on the relevance of that for our own context. So that's how all of that moves. Now, before we move to the next slide, which will be on Tolstoy's pacifism, and I've got a slide for each of the four. That's basically it, and then some questions, I suppose, that we might want to look at, but we don't have to at the end. Before I do that, I should perhaps say that the way I set up the argument in the book, which I think is legitimate, but is worth noting, especially for you guys, I guess, is to say that Tolstoy uses Christian vocabulary and Christian references throughout what he talks about in the last 30 years of his life, his pacifism, his anarchism, his anti-clericalism, etc. But I think it's fair to say that he uses that Christian vocabulary, those Christian references, well, in an atypical Christian way, and actually almost perhaps in a way, I think he expected that language to speak to more people than if he didn't use it. I think he, I'll come back to that in a bit. He's not a typical Christian in many ways, and yet he means to address people way beyond Christianity. He's speaking to the whole of humanity, but he's using Christian vocabulary. The irony is, if he thought at the time that doing so would help expand his potential audience, a century and a bit on, with different waves of secularization in different places, that kind of Christian vocabulary, if anything, has closed his thoughts to anyone who's not necessarily sympathetic to that Christian vocabulary. Anyway, that's kind of something to bear in mind, I suppose. And I get to that on the next slide. So, Ange, you're right to push to the next slide. That one's really brief, and it's just to make that point. So you will know that Tolstoy kind of converts to his peculiar version of Christianity in the late 1870s for the last 30 years of his life. His version of Christianity is very rationalistic. I call it deistic. He doesn't believe in the resurrection. He's just really interested in the morality preached by Jesus as reported in the gospel. He likes Jesus' teaching and Jesus' example, and in particular, the Sermon on the Mount and the turning of the other cheek. And so, as I said, he uses Christian terminology, and he will deliberately embrace vocabulary such as God, the resurrection, revelation, kingdom of God. But the meaning he ascribes to these is very rationalistic. It's very atypical, and it means to speak way beyond just the confines of the Christian world. It's got a deistic meaning then. He means to address all human beings, as I said. So then, please, the next slide, Angela. That's the pacifism one. I'll stay with that one for a bit. So I'll take you through each of these, again, rather quickly, but it's just to summarize and give you a flavor of what I think are the main components of his political thought. The thing it all hinges on is his reading of Matthew 5 and Jesus's counsel to turn the other cheek. On the basis of that, Tolstoy develops a range of different reflections scattered across his writing. So it's not particularly systematic or explained systematically anywhere, but lots of different critiques of violence, of why violence is wrong, why it's counterproductive. In the book version, I think I break them down into 10 different issues he has with violence, and some of them are more what we might call deontological, as in they are arguments for why violence is wrong as such, because it's, it hurts, etc., that kind of thing. Some arguments are more consequentialist, so they are about why violence is wrong because of what it does, because of the consequences it has in the long run. And some of them have to do with what in philosophy they call virtue ethics, but it's kind of what violence does to the perpetrator, the way it brutalizes the perpetrator, and makes violence more likely in the long run, for example. So he's got lots of arguments about violence that he riffs off his reading of Jesus's counsel to turn the other cheek. For him, what Jesus proposes is a radically revolutionary alternative, which focuses on love, on forgiveness, on generosity as methods to overcome the cycle of violence. He likes the way in which Jesus's reply kind of surprises those who observe it by his magnanimity, by the respect he shows to the one who is smiting, to the one who's committing the violence, by its refusal to dehumanize, but precisely, to treat the other with respect. So he has a lot to say around that, Tolstoy does. He also likes the passages where Jesus calls not to judge, and on the basis of that, he'll develop some anarchist critique as well, which I'll come to in a bit. The various passages to forgive 77 times, etc., the stoning of the adulteress. from all of these, he again takes kind of a reinforcement of the message to do no violence under any circumstance. He argues, although that's my vocabulary, not his, I guess, but it's quite clear in his argument that for him, both the cycle of violence and the cycle of forgiveness, if you will, are contagious. And the idea is you overcome the violence of the world and its cyclical nature by kind of superimposing upon that a cycle of forgiveness and generosity, which in the end dominates in the way the cycle of violence might dominate today. And for him, the way to do that, again, as he sees Jesus teaching it as well, is to teach it by example, not by top-down decrees or by coercion, but by showing the example of forgiving, of turning the other cheek, which might hopefully inspire a wave of people to follow. And final point there, which I developed briefly, and a little bit more in the book, I suppose, is to simply make the point, but again, you probably don't need to hear that, but this isn't a kind of passivity, it's not an easy route. To turn the other cheek to someone who has smitten you unjustly takes courage and willingness to sacrifice. It's not, it's not a form of quietism or passivity. In terms of criticisms, some of them Tolstoy addresses himself. He was accused of being a utopian. There's a quote I really like to cite from Tolstoy. I don't have it here. I won't read it now. But he basically responds that, you could say that what Jesus calls for is utopian, but you can't deny that he said it. It is what Jesus calls for, even if you think it's utopian. And if you're not a Christian and you don't necessarily therefore want to follow what Jesus says because of who he was or the authority you might ascribe to him, at the very least, this way of thinking as an invitation for us to think differently about violence, about how violence is perpetrated and reinforced, about the cycle of violence in society and about how we might overcome it. One of the classic criticisms leveled at pacifists in general and was leveled at Tolstoy, and I think, and it's a particularly tricky one for him, as I'll explain. Second point there is to put it as a question: what about children are under attack, and what about people like Hitler? Would you stand back and let those injustices happen? And I don't think Tolstoy deals with it completely in complete fairness, as in, because he wants to really stick as rigidly as possible to the ambition not to use violence at all. He offers a few bits of responses, but and so one of them is to point out that there are options between capitulating to the Hitler and the child attacker and committing violence. You can interpose with your body, you can try and plead. That may not work in the whole time, of course, but there are options. I think Tolstoy is wary of the thin edge of the wedge. He worries that by conceding that violence may be acceptable in some cases, suddenly, very quickly, all sorts of violence becomes acceptable. And he points out that it's worth remembering what violence the scenario enables, by which I mean, by admitting that violence may be necessary to protect vulnerable people, we consent to the creation of a system that does that for us. We consent to the creation of a state that will use the way it has sort of learned to manipulate that machine for all sorts of reasons further down the line. And one of his quotes, which I mentioned in the book, he talks about how he has never met that person who wanted to molest a child, which might be slightly disingenuous, but at least I suppose the point is it doesn't happen a lot, if we're fair with Tolstoy for a second. Whereas he says he meets every day people who commit violence against laborers, against children, against all people, against all sorts of people, based on the argument that such a state is necessary to protect us from the much rarer child molester, for example. So again, I don't think that closes the question. He kind of tries to avoid it. And the other argument I suppose he throws back at us is that it's about, for him, it's about maintaining purity with the ideal, even if in practice we don't manage to do it. So he doesn't want to concede to the principle of accepting exceptions, even if, as he would say, see it, I think, compromise might be difficult to avoid in practice. He would see it as a failure to live up to the ideal, but he is an absolutist in that sense when it comes to his pacifism, and that's one of the reasons he's not necessarily widely embraced in the pacifist tradition. We can talk about that later if you want, but I've said enough on that second point, I think. one of the minor criticism I mentioned here, he doesn't define violence. He doesn't say what he
Right.
means, but I think it's fair to say that what he means is physical violence, although you could extend his critique. Oh, hello?
Living room.
Oh, living room. Someone's not muted. It's fair to say I think he means physical violence primarily, although I think you can extend his argument to systemic violence and structural violence. And in fact, that's what he does explicitly when he develops his anarchism, but we'll come to that in a second. In terms of the relevance of all that, well, he obviously in turn influenced Gandhi, as I'm guessing most of you know, quite directly, although Gandhi had other influences too. Let's not just explain Gandhi's pacifism on Tolstoy. He influenced lots of conscientious objectors. A number of people genuinely kind of dropped their vocation and tried to live out a kind of Tolstoyan ideal at the time. It didn't work for many, but that's, again, another thing we can come to later. But he did influence all sorts of people at the time. He was a famous voice at the time, and he certainly made ripples across the Western world, I suppose, and beyond. I also make the point in the book and in the chapter that many, and not necessarily only Christians, still see Jesus as an interesting moral teacher. And to the extent that Tolstoy does that and develops the thought that you can develop from Jesus, he contributes to us all, I suppose, approaching Jesus as an interesting moral teacher. But again, I'll move on. I do think it remains important to unmask and denounce the violence of human institutions. Whether we follow Tolstoy entirely on everything he might say, we can still follow him when it comes to his denunciation of the violence that is prevalent, not just when he wrote, but still today, and violence that is that we inflict on each other through the institutions that we have set up or we consent to. I also argue briefly that his critique anticipates more recent scholarship and practice. So in lots of areas of scholarship, in particular in social psychology and criminology and pedagogy and various strands of politics and political science, have developed since Tolstoy lines of thinking that give more credit to the power of love and forgiveness, to the role of the kind of contagious cycle of violence, etc. There's been lots of thought that has been developed since he wrote that, and in a way, therefore, he anticipates it. And so this isn't to say that these various areas of scholarship were inspired by Tolstoy, but he speaks in a way that becomes more compatible with the way in which we've come to think about these things, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. And in general, I think reading him on his pacifist views invites us all to reconsider our own assumptions about what violence is acceptable or not. Okay, I'll stop on the pacifism now. I'm inevitably talking more than I thought I would. I hope that's okay in terms of a pace. I'm still talking a bit quickly. Is that all right? I'll proceed similarly with the other three. Is that okay? Again, faces are nodding. So, right, great, thanks. Ange, could you skip to the next one, please? Perfect. So, his anarchism. One of the quotes I like to cite from him is as follows, quote, "Christianity in its true sense puts an end to the state. It was so understood from its very beginning, and for that Christ was crucified," unquote. This is classic Tolstoy, very syllogistic in the way it's explained, very kind of logical. Christianity puts an end to the state. That's as clear as crystal for him. It was seen as that from the beginning, and that's precisely why Jesus was crucified. So that's a theme that I develop on a bit, both in the chapter and in the book. Tolstoy is critical of democracy, representative democracy, certainly, but in general, the imposition of a decision by a majority on what is a minority that may not approve of it. Now, it's easy to criticize, the solution is harder to find, but he points out that, majority rule is still tyranny of the majority, whichever way you want to skin it. He's critical of laws in general, because he says, laws require violence to be implemented, and violence is a form of slavery, he even says. And in, again, a very kind of typical syllogistic fashion, kind of logical in his mind fashion, he will say, well, one of two things. Either people are irrational, in which case no one has the right to inflict violence on others. No individual is more rational than others and has the right to inflict violence. We're all irrational. Or people are rational, and in that case, we can all reason, and there's no need to use violence against any particular individual. Classic rationalistic thinking for Tolstoy. Again, there are quotes about that in the longer versions. He points out that the state system is so arranged to facilitate erosion of responsibility. So because of the way in which people are put to prison, different individuals deal with different elements of kind of getting this done. And it allows every little cog in the system to say, well, it's not my decision. You know, this decision is called by the people, or by my role. People expect me to do this, or, you know, the order comes from above. But it's not my moral responsibility that this violence has been inflicted, even though I've been part of the system. And I think, you know, he's, again, one of the early thinkers who makes that argument. Hannah Arendt develops it famously later in the 20th century, when she talks about the banality of evil, reflecting on the Holocaust. But yeah, for him, the state is there. The real purpose of the state is that it's there to, you know, deploy its coercive apparatus, its violence, to protect the elites' wealth, which it has stolen either from foreign lands in various colonial adventures, or from the people through taxes and various forms of wage slavery, etc. And that's why the state's there, he says. In a way, the state works a bit like a protection racket, a bit like the mafia. It does the very thing it claims to be there to protect you from. I think it's worth noting, on a different line of thought, when it comes to his anarchism, he definitely has a high admiration for the rural life of Russian peasants at the time. That's visible throughout his corpus. He clearly idolizes that way of life. There are, for those who are familiar with that, the echoes of Rousseau's thought in this, but I'll leave that aside. But certainly one of his dislikes of the state has to do with the way he could see, I suppose, in his own world, how modernization, industrialization, the expansion of cities was, eroding the life of Russian peasants, which he thought was a lot more natural, was able to kind of govern itself independently of the big Russian state that was increasingly affirming itself. And so he clearly idolizes, that kind of way of life, I suppose. In terms of criticisms, it's been said, not untruthfully, I suppose, that he's a bit too black and white and too simplistic in his way of thinking. It's too categorical in his dismissal of all things to do with the state, for example. And that's valid enough, I suppose, but it's, the state still does inflict violence more often than we might want to remember. And it might be that, he's a bit too quick in dumping everything out as a result. But the violence of the state is a thing that happens daily in every state, and at least he points us to it. He reminds us of it, I suppose. Some will argue that states today, in particular today, more so than in Tolstoy's years, does provide welfare and education and various other goods, public goods and good things. Perhaps, and I speak from France, where that is a view held strongly, including by my in-laws. But at the very least, let's note that these things are being eroded at every opportunity, and the austerity of the last 10 years is another such opportunity. We've seen these things being eroded. And more to the point, the core business of the state remains coercive, and that core business is alive and kicking. So they're happy to, implement cuts to the NHS, to education, to lots of things. But when it comes to defunding the police, one of the things we hear about in the UK, in the US, that seems to be much harder to do. The state is very good at expanding its various tentacles of surveillance and violence, but and does that with much more easily than protect the kind of welfare policies and education policies that have been, I suppose, achieved since the Second World War in particular. Some argue that democracy is still the best form of government. What is the Churchill quote? Democracy is the worst form of government, except all the other ones that we've tried from time to time. Classic Churchill quote there. If that's really how we can think about, let me rephrase this. Hopefully, human beings as a collective are able to imagine even better models of government. If that's the end of our political imagination, then it's a little bit disappointing. It might be true that democracy is probably better than living in North Korea today, sure, but we're still a long way from actual democracy in the way we practice democracy. We live in approximations of it, poor approximations in many cases. So surely, can we not improve on the current model of representative democracy? Is that the best, really? And then the argument also thrown at Tolstoy and other anarchists is that the state, of course, protects us from criminals and from people who will commit violence upon others. there are several replies to that in the book version in particular, one of which is, does it really succeed? I mean, there's still a lot of violence and criminality, and the state doesn't necessarily seem to actually be all that successful at preventing it. Is it the case that it prevents criminals from committing injustices, or does it give to potential criminals, if we can use that term, the opportunity to take the reins of the state and expand their own, injustices and criminalities, as it were, wrong terms, but yeah. So one of the issues is, once you set up a pyramidal structure like the state, how do you make sure that the people who take control of it or use it for their own ends are actually the good people, rather than the ones that the state was supposed to be there to prevent? So lots of different responses to that one in particular, in the book especially. But so again, several criticisms leveled at Tolstoy and anarchism, 7 potential replies, I think, or things worth considering in reply. In terms of where that leaves us today, the state has certainly evolved. It's not the same as it was in Tolstoy's Russia, but the coercive machinery of the state is stronger than ever, and it continues to underpin all sorts of structures of oppression. I mean, why would people put up with wage slavery or all sorts of inequalities and injustices were it not for the fact that the state is still very much there to make sure that we all adhere to the laws and keep the peace and basically respect this particular order of things, and that the state is still the underwriter of it all. Secondly, concrete state violence, never mind the threat of it that maintains us all where we are, but concrete state violence still happens daily, as does evasion of responsibility by the various cogs of it. And finally, a slightly different line of thinking here, but final point on that slide, in terms of Tolstoy's place in the anarchist canon, well, it is debated. He's an awkward anarchist because of his religious elements, as it were. But he remains an important voice, I think, in Christian anarchist thought, even though even within Christian anarchist thought, he's an awkward beast because of his awkward Christianity. But he's a famous name, and he's one that several other anarchists have bounced off again. So, do you want to include him or not in your anarchist canon? If you need a canon, I accept it's up for debate, but I still think he at the very least, it is up for potential inclusion. And it's also the case that Tolstoy helped clear the path for a convergence of anarchism and pacifism in some circles. He is an anarcho-pacifist in many ways. There weren't necessarily many before him that were anarchists because they were pacifists. So really merging the kind of 2 strands of thought. And Tolstoy's an important contributor to that, I think. Next slide, please, to move to his anti-clericalism. I think I'll be quicker on this one. For Tolstoy, ever since Constantine, the church has become an obstacle to the dissemination of Jesus' teaching. It started before Constantine, but for him, the conversion of Constantine to Christianity is, perhaps the best illustration of the way in which it's not that we all converted to Christianity, but Christianity was adopted to the empire to maintain to the current order, basically. And so Tolstoy has all sorts of things that he rails against the church for. I mean, he's very critical, very anti-clerical. He denounces the doctrine of infallibility of either the church or the Bible. He's very critical of theologians who like to discount Jesus' ethics and point to all sorts of things instead of the pretty clear and repeated injunctions to turn the other cheek, to forgive, etc., in the version of the Bible that reached us. And he's very critical of what he calls, tools in mental trickery, as it were, to distract from Jesus' revolutionary morality. So not just the fact that the revolutionary morality is discounted and we're told, well, it's not really important, or it's for the afterworld, it's not for us here, but actually the fact that lots of other things are put there in place to keep us distracted. So he dislikes the creeds, and in particular the Nicene Creed. He dislikes various forms of external worship, which he sees us as kind of robotically repeating to ourselves as, again, a way of kind of focusing our attention, our time, I suppose, on that as a version of Christianity. He criticizes the mixing of truths with falsehoods in the way the church teaches Jesus, I suppose. And he dislikes the way all of that amounts to a form of hypnotization of the people and a replacement, a kind of a deliberate, how shall I put it, a deliberate appeasing, so it's not the word I'm looking for, of reason. So we get hypnotized instead of having our capacity to reason actually lead us through a better understanding of Christianity. So there's lots he says about the church that he dislikes, and that's one of the reasons he gets excommunicated in 1901. The actual event that does that, if you're interested, it's in his third famous novel called Resurrection, kind of unfinished but still published, and there's a couple of chapters in there where he describes the Eucharist as performed in a prison, I think, but it's not some of the prison bit so much, but the way he describes the Eucharist being performed is deeply sarcastic. I mean, the censorship at the time only allows, from the 2 chapters that does that, 1 sentence to survive, and it's the service began, the rest they edit out. The church didn't like it and used that particular, those 2 chapters and the book in general as the excuse to excommunicate him, which of course, made his thought gather even more attention, but that's a different debate. In terms of criticisms leveled at this anti-clericalism, it's very rationalistic, his version of Christianity, too rationalistic, and there's various critiques of reason today, not just people who might say that, religion isn't to be approached purely rationalistically, but also those coming from post-structuralist lines of thought, I suppose, postmodern, etc., that distrust the way in which reason can be used as a tool to impose certain things on people, and it has been historically. And much as I sympathize with those arguments, what other tools do we have against, the way in which Trump does his politics, for example, or other forms of demagoguery and cynicism? We might not want to call it reason. We might not want to follow Tolstoy in calling it reason. But what Tolstoy refers to when he speaks of reason is perhaps the only thing we do have to try and sort of see through the rubbish that is thrown at us, to use simplistic terms anyway. There is a criticism that religion, of course, is not only morality. There's much more to it than that, and that certainly is true and worth noting. But at the very same time, I think you can flip the thing around and say that ethical concerns are nonetheless still central to every religious tradition, and in Christianity no less. And therefore, to those who say he overvalues morality, he should be thinking about other kind of theological elements, mystical elements. You could also throw back and say, yeah, but are you undervaluing morality and overemphasizing the other bits yourselves then? And finally, there is the argument that what he criticizes isn't really representative of all of Christianity or all institutional Christianity. And of course, that's true. There have been all sorts of offshoots and currents within what we might call Christianity that are closer to what Tolstoy advocates. Nevertheless, what he says and the way, what he levels at the church does apply to most churches for most of the history of Christianity. So yes, it doesn't necessarily apply to all the bits, but it applies to a lot nevertheless. The relevance of all that today, well, first of all, religion still does influence politics and vice versa. That kind of duet is ongoing, and therefore his criticism of it remains standing. The collaboration of state and church persists despite secularization and the way that's transformed Western society, well, Western Europe really mainly, but so a lot of what he says about why the church and I suppose religious institutions, if you make it broader, influence politics and shouldn't, still applies today, no less than it did anyway at the time. The kind of critique he levels at the church resonates with anyone who's disillusioned by what some people call institutional Christianity, whether you follow Tolstoy and other bits. And Tolstoy today will certainly reiterate his appeal for Christians in particular to reconsider Jesus's teaching anew. Not something I need to preach, I think, in this particular group, but something that I think this particular group will be familiar trying to preach to the broader constituency of Christians out there, I suppose. And then the last main bit is the next slide, please, Ange. That's on Tolstoy's activist methods. I tried in the book, I think legitimately, to precisely try and dissociate his pacifism from his anarchism, even though they overlap at times, and from what he says we should therefore do about it, which is what I've called his activist methods. But of course, there's overlap and mutual influence. But so, firstly, in terms of what we should do about things, first of all, Tolstoy warns against adopting any form of violent revolutionary methods. no compromise in that regard for him is acceptable. For him, the only truly revolutionary method is the change of heart and the leading by example that can be produced by remarkable examples of trying to live out Tolstoy's teaching. He thinks that can be contagious, as I said before, and he hopes that's the motor of the revolution, basically, that teaching by example and the change of heart it can lead to. Tolstoy preaches various forms of ascetic self-control. That's the only reference I have here to what is the 4th chapter in the book version. He, himself, he gave up alcohol, sugar, meat eating, hunting, gambling. He tried to live as ascetically as he could in a number of ways, although very imperfectly, and we can go into that, and the way he treats his wife is problematic, but certainly he preaches a form of ascetic self-control, partly because all this stuff, all the material pleasures of life come through forms of economic exploitation, and the other thing for him is they distract the mind. So when we're drunk, we don't think rationally. When the people are drunk and drinking too much vodka, then they're made fools of more easily by the state. He advocates manual work. For him, it's healthy. It's something that leads to self-sufficiency. Communities that can grow their own food don't need to rely on other parts of the economy for feeding. It leads to a form of contentment. It's visible again throughout his literature, how manual work for him is something that's very good. And that's one of the reasons he admires the life of agricultural communes in Russia at the time, because they're engaged in a lot of manual work. And he himself engages in a lot of that. So by his own example, he tries to grow his own food. He makes his own shoes. He became a vegetarian. He signed off his royalties for all his latter work against the wishes of his wife. Again, we can come back to that if you want later on, but it led to tensions within his family. And just to make that clear, he doesn't preach non-resistance, but non-violent resistance. And I think it's important to make that point. I think it's pretty clear from his corpus, although there are a couple of passages as they are translated that could suggest otherwise. But we can come back to that if you want, again, in discussion. In terms of criticisms of all that, some people say that any form of non-violent activism is ineffective, only violence will work. Well, many revolutions that have been successful have hinged on a change of allegiance among the backers of the regime. And that doesn't come if you strike them, it comes if you make them doubt the moral superiority of the regime that they're backing. I mean, there's been very interesting work in the last 10 years on all that. There's a famous study by Erika Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, Why Civil Resistance Works, I think it's called. It's a very thorough study that looks at how actually, if you look at the last 100 years or so of violent and non-violent struggles, it seems that non-violent forms of resistance are more effective. Let's be clear, both violent and non-violent forms of resistance fail more often than they succeed, but non-violent ones fail less often than violent ones. And that's what emerges from the data. And that does seem to be in part because of the way it influences both, I suppose, the regime backers, the broader public, etc. But again, I'll leave that aside for the moment. Some people say that what we need isn't lifestyleism, just lifestyle changes, be a nice example. We need collective struggle. We need to organize in the workplace, etc. My response to that is these things aren't incompatible. You can do the same. You can do both, but different hours of the day. Tolstoy does focus on what you might want to call lifestyleism more than collective struggle, but that doesn't mean you can't prioritize collective struggle as well. Some people say what Tolstoy preaches amounts to collective suicide. If we all turn the other cheek, we'll all be killed. But that assumes that no change of heart can happen. In other words, that there can be no convert in the first place to such a method. And that's precisely what Tolstoy hopes wouldn't happen. So he hopes that Jesus's method would transform humanity before it leads to collective suicide. It does mean that a lot of people will suffer and die in the process. The people who put their body forward, it doesn't mean this isn't bloodless, but the hope is that it transforms the whole collective instead of leading just to the sort of suicide of the most peaceful bits, I suppose. Again, more on that later if you want. Some people say what he preaches in general is a kind of self-denial that is too prohibitive, too ascetic, kind of dull life. And, that might be the case, and it might be that, you do like your wine. I do. I can't follow him on rejecting vodka. But I suppose at the very least, it's good to remain alert to the dubious production processes that are behind the things, the material pleasures we happen to enjoy in life. And it is worth remaining alert as well to the way in which it helps us escape, I suppose, the harsh reality of the world, and therefore fail to remember that all these forms of suffering are happening. So, there's Tolstoy's two critiques of material pleasures, I think, are addressed there. So both the way things are produced and the way it helps us escape reality. So we can remember that whilst not necessarily following him entirely on his ascetic self-denial. And then finally, there's the argument that, non-violence is too slow. Changing the world one heart at a time is certainly slower than, for those who manage to, changing it by top-down change, by grappling the reins of power. Perhaps, but violent transformations are unstable. And maybe the process is too slow, but the faster ones aren't necessarily more stable or better. But again, leave that aside as an open question. The relevance of it all for us today, I think, again, Tolstoy invites us to seriously consider the dangers of compromising with violence. And as I've said before, non-violent activist methods seem to be increasingly more effective. There's increasing evidence that they're effective, and they're adopted increasingly nowadays. So I think, in a sense, again, there he kind of anticipates the way in which activism would come to evolve, especially recently. I like to argue that there are, I don't know if I like to argue, but one of the things that as I like to put them, is that we, as in the human race, face three huge collective challenges. You could argue there are more, but for me, my top three are ecological, the global warming and everything related to that. The economy, we came close to the total collapse of capitalism in 2008, and this will happen again because the stuff that led to it hasn't gone away. They haven't regulated the banks, etc., and it's a deeply unfair economy, and that's unstable too. And then there's, broadly speaking, security, that anything from sort of terrorism to weapons of mass destruction. We were terrified of nuclear weapons during the Cold War, at least my parents were. And we forget about them now, but there ain't a lot fewer than them. More actors have them. The risk of nuclear conflagration remains. For me, those three challenges are massive, and they require human awakening. And precisely for that reason, we need to think carefully about tactics. And violent tactics to address these are arguably not going to work, certainly if you follow Tolstoy. So I think Tolstoy helps us think about tactics to address these three colossal challenges. And it's worth noting that Tolstoy isn't only addressing what he says to the radicals and the revolutionaries who want to change the world, but also to all those who are part of the system, to the producers, as in what we do in our job as well, to consumers, as in what we choose to consume, to citizens in the various way they do politics, and in the micro-politics of everyday life. In all of these, I think we can reflect about our role in maintaining violence at a distance. Having said all that, Tolstoy's criticisms are addressed primarily at those higher up the pyramid. He's most bitter about those who benefit from the system, and it is them that he wants to tell off and awaken on the issue of violence more than the revolutionaries who want to change it. He's critical of both, but of course the moral responsibility, if you want, is higher the higher up the pyramid you go. So my conclusion, which is on the next slide, please, Ange, is that Tolstoy might be an awkward Christian, an awkward anarchist, and an awkward pacifist. He's an awkward Christian because he doesn't subscribe to any of the traditional dogmas. He only emphasizes the morality. He's an awkward anarchist because of his religious elements, even though he does reject the state. And he's an awkward pacifist because he's very extreme in his pacifism. He goes further than most pacifists would. Nevertheless, he's an interesting Christian, an interesting anarchist, and an interesting pacifist. He did adapt his language to the different audiences he spoke to. He usually used Christian vocabulary, but he didn't do so only because he spoke to Christians. He wanted social transformation in general, and he preached it through a Christian vocabulary because he hoped that was the way to get there. And I think that, given the structural and the direct violence of today's global political economy, given the threats to security from terrorism to weapons of mass destruction, given the structural and the direct violence tied to ecological collapse, it's well worth engaging with Tolstoy when pondering our choices and our contributions, direct and indirect, to the world that surrounds us. And that's that. And then the next slide is just kind of questions of discussion. I think Scott encouraged me to think about that, or maybe I'm mixing things up, but these are just questions we could discuss if you want to. Then we don't have to. But following from Tolstoy's thinking, do we agree that violence is absolutely always wrong in the way that he does? Are we ready to follow him that far? Is state violence sometimes ever legitimate? Is it ever effective? Well, how much responsibility do we have for it when we vote, or when we just benefit from what the state does? I don't know. Is the church an obstacle to the dissemination of Jesus's morality, which is what obviously Tolstoy argues? Should any compromise with violence, direct or indirect, be avoided in activism at any cost? And what are the obstacles to wider engagement with Tolstoy today? What might help overcome these? We don't have to touch on these at all. I just put them there as questions to ponder if you want to, but that's me talking, probably more than you wanted to, but there you go.
So we're back in the room.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, nice one.
Cheers, Alex.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Zoom clap, thank you. So yeah, questions, discussions, and it doesn't have to be dominating. I wonder what you make of it all. And as I said, that's expanded in the book, which I'm happy to share, but the chapter version is freely available online anyway.
Well, I have something, Alex, if you don't mind. If I understand you correctly, Tolstoy's, in terms of his own commitment to nonviolence, if he were to have ever committed a violent act, or then what he would do is not somehow bring that into kind of the moral hierarchy as some achievement or some way of saying I'm still doing God's will, but rather he would say this is a failure to do God's will, and I acted purely instinctually, but I was not keeping the terms of Jesus's morality. I wasn't keeping to that, which is very similar to the way I feel. So when people say to me, what would you do if somebody attacked your children? I generally say, I don't know. I've never been in that situation. I know what I'd like to do, and I know what I'd like to train my mind to do. However, if I was to do it, if I was to hurt someone in that process, I would never say that this is somehow what Jesus would want me to do, or somehow this is like my divine prerogative to protect my family. It would more be a failure of my ability to follow Jesus. Is that how he is that similar to how he might have understood it?
I think so. I mean, he doesn't use those terms explicitly, but when, so it's complicated. So there is a passage somewhere, I can't remember, I think it's in a letter, where he kind of says, so it's a letter, and that's important to bear in mind. He doesn't mean to publish it, although it's published since, that he would not stand in the way of someone looking to harm his children, he says, in a letter. But somewhere else, I think it's in What I Believe, which is one of his main texts, towards the end, he says that he commits to never inflicting any violence. And I think he puts something in the English tradition, it's save towards a child who's about to be attacked or something like that. And even the phrasing is awkward, because he wouldn't attack the child. It can't be that he means, but so he clearly seems to have in mind that it would be an issue. That is kind of the most challenging. It's as challenging as it gets. But he never was tested. And yes, I guess if you look at what he says elsewhere, he does basically say that. Sorry, someone's trying to get in. He does basically say that it would be a failure to live by what is required. I don't know would he say God's will? He possibly would, but by that he would mean what it is rational to do, and that's
the teachings of Jesus. a failure to live up to the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount.
Yes, which he values, not because of who Jesus was, because he doesn't buy the resurrection, but because he thinks that what Jesus says is the most reasonable that's ever been said, the most rational that's been said about violence, which is, for there not to be violence, you mustn't do any.
Right.
I used to be totally sold out with Tolstoy's ideas on non-violence, and I've come up to a totally different point, I think, or I'm not totally convinced of my point yet, but I'm certainly not convinced of Tolstoy's. You know, I think the teachings of Jesus were about to love, and I think sometimes violence is the best way to love people, in the sense that I've recently read a book called Fighting Fascists, The Secret History of Anti-Fascist Action. And in the areas where anti-fascist action were operating, the rates of violence, attacks against minorities vastly dropped. And therefore, I see love as the ultimate, that love has achieved the protection of a minority. And I think I'd go along with Tolstoy that violence is a useless tool against the state, but to stop that violence at square one is an act of love.
I certainly acknowledge that that one's a tricky one, and I'm sympathetic to what you're saying. I don't know if I'm 100% Tolstoy myself anyway, but I think one thing, in fairness, to point out is it's about where we are in the first place as well. So if I get there the long way, if you don't mind, briefly by going full Hitler first, as in, people ask, would you have let Hitler invade? Well, the question doesn't start in 1940 or 1939. It begins with the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles and the terms that were imposed on Germany in the first place. When you impose you impose certain policies that lead to resentment, to frustration. When you, to bring it back to what you're saying, but when you have a society that makes certain people feel as if an injustice is being committed to them, but they blame it on immigrants, obviously wrongly, but they've been mistreated, they've suffered injustice themselves, they for some reason decide to blame it on certain people and will commit violence, then you already have the problem. What you do in response to that isn't only what you do there and then and the slapping of a fascist, or it's preventing that that terrain of injustice to sort of lead to the rise of fascism in the first place. Now, it's an easy answer because, it doesn't confront the reality that next door there's some thugs who are about to beat someone. And so that's why I don't want to claim that, I've resolved this for you. I acknowledge what you're saying. I have sympathies with those anti-fascist positions, and, punching a Nazi may not be such a wrong thing. But Tolstoy would absolutely reject that. And that might be why, many of us, and many of the people who might be sympathetic with what a lot of Tolstoy might say couldn't necessarily follow him all the way.
Can I raise a point about resisting fascism with violence? I think Tolstoy would have agreed with the expansion of nonviolent resistance to include fighting against invasions and coups d'etats. And if you're interested, Gene Sharp actually talks about this in relation to Hitler, that nonviolent action was successfully used against Hitler. So the women of Berlin who had Jewish husbands successfully used nonviolent action to get their husbands out of prison, their Jewish husbands out of prison. That happened. Belgians used strikes against Hitler to try and slow down his activity. Loads of German soldiers in the Nazi army allowed Jews to escape. They just didn't check their papers. They allowed them to leave Germany. As well, I think Germany itself used nonviolent resistance in something called civilian-based defense against France and Belgium when they invaded in the 1920s in the Ruhr invasion. So I think Tolstoy would have been very much in agreement with Gene Sharp's idea that you can expand nonviolent resistance out from, it's not just simply resisting the state, but you can use it to stop a coup, like a coup plot.
I think you're right.
Invasion,
Yeah, no, I think you're. So can I say two things? So first off, it's also probably important to note that Tolstoy talks in a very kind of, do you want to say abstract? It's, you know, let me rephrase. It takes Gandhi in particular to operationalize the kind of thinking that Tolstoy develops. So Tolstoy is it's more abstract in many ways what he says. And Gandhi, you know, is inspired by Tolstoy and others, and as well as religious traditions, but, you know, Thoreau and others. But what Gandhi does, that is in many ways a way of operationalizing the kind of thinking that Tolstoy preaches. So, and then once you've done that, then then you can see, I suppose, Gandhian or perhaps Tolstoyan ways of responding, such as, which I think would be a fair way of characterizing what you've listed and what Gene Sharp has listed. Tolstoy himself, the reason I say that, I think Tolstoy himself conceived of precisely how to act in such situations. He doesn't really speculate about that. He doesn't really enact them himself. I mean, he preaches what he preaches from Yasnaya Polyana. He does his work, but he doesn't engage in thought marches and whatnot. He doesn't have to. I think the only, I suppose, form of resistance, he was longing for the Russian state to arrest him so that he could be put in prison and suffer there. But it never happened, although they persecuted his followers. So that's one thing just worth noting, you know, because he speaks in a very abstract way, and the others follow in, I think, what is the same line of thinking, but they operationalize it when he hadn't really. The other thing to say, I guess, is I think what all of these ways of thinking do, Gene Sharp, Tolstoy, Gandhi, and many more, when you're asked then about the question of, you know, fascist thugs about to beat people, it's at least refusing to leave the question on the sort of what you do there and then if someone's about to attack someone. It's kind of trying to, and it's refusing to think that the solution is just to slap them or punch them as if that resolves things. The people who are fascists remain human beings who, for some reason, you know, drifted the way they did, and the ideology they subscribe to is abhorrent. It is willing to commit violence. It is discriminating, you know, etc. Hopefully unnecessary for me to point out that it's utterly despicable. But punching people doesn't prevent them or other people from reaching the position that they reached. And it's about thinking about how you sort of avoid that in the first place. So that goes back to my original answer, I suppose, to you, Igor. But so again, I'm not saying it's one or the other, and it may be that, you know, you maybe do need to sort of punch a Nazi, but don't leave it there. But yeah, I don't mean to resolve it for you or anyone, because I'm not sure what I would do. But yes, good point, Kyle. I think thanks for making it. There were ways of resisting Hitler non-violently that were practiced and may well have contributed to the broader struggle, I suppose, or something like that.
Alex, I had read that in Germany there were some fascist marches in some villages, and the villagers decided to get together and say every time they marched in our village, we would donate like 1,000 euros to some asylum seekers or something like that. And it actually brought the level of marches down. Like they said, well, what's the point in marching here if every time we do it, they're going to donate money to you know, Africans living in Germany, you know. I think there's other ways of doing it. I mean, I know it's a bit pedantic to talk about something like that, but I think we have lots of things at our disposal.
But so what that makes me want to say as well, to add to all of this that we're saying, is I think both one of the challenges, but also what's so much more interesting about, I suppose, the way of non-violence is that we have to be creative. You see, violence is uncreative. It's easy. You know, it's fairly straightforward. We know what it involves. I mean, you can choose your weapon, I suppose, but it's pretty uncreative. Non-violence replies, non-violence ways of activism are, I mean, Gene Sharp listed 198 of them. There's more since. There's lots of ways of doing things, but it does involve thinking cleverly and creatively about what might work. That's a brilliant example of villagers coming up with a pretty creative solution. And what works in one case may not work in another. But that call for creativity is also what's so wonderful about it. It shows what the human potential, the human collective can come up with creatively to deal with particular struggles. So yeah, there isn't a single solution, but yes, so what you might say is part of the problem is it's fluffy and you don't have an easy solution, is also part of the solution. And what's nice about the solution is it does call on human creativity and thinking about different ways it applies to different contexts, and it can be done. And there's lots of examples such as the ones you've given, I think, that are worth thinking about.
I think for me, one of the biggest challenges with violence is that of a parent to a child. And the reason I say
that... Of a parent to a child, you
Yeah.
said? Yeah.
The reason I say that is my mother was the main physical abuser in our household, but it was seen very much as maintaining control. It wasn't seen as cruel or anything. And my mum used to hit us so hard that our ears would ring for the next 4 days because she'd hit us around the head. But my mother would always believe, and believed until her dying day, that she was being lenient with us because she didn't hit us with a belt buckle, which is what her father did. And to put that in context, you have to agree and empathize really with where she's coming from, because the world she lived in was very different. When I became a parent, I have one sister who became a senior social worker who avowed for the rest of her days she was never going to lay a hand on her children, and then hated herself when she did. Because in my experience, your child only knows what buttons to push in what order to get you to scream in paroxysms, something else. And yet I only ever physically hit my child, and that was when he was about to run under a car in front of the supermarket. And I smacked the back of his legs really hard with my hand because I couldn't grab him quick enough. So I just went bang, and he was startled enough to look at me. Another shopper started tutting. So I asked if she was prepared to scoop him off the windshield of the car and take him home in a bag with her instead then. But subsequent to that time, every time I personally have felt violence within because of the situation I'm in, I've learned enough to know that that is a deficit in me and not a direct result of my child's actions. And the best example I've got is my mother sent me shopping for something that was far too big to carry with 2 children under the age of 3 with me. And I got very upset and very frantic, primarily because I felt like I couldn't care for them and carry this parcel. And they were too young to understand what I was asking them to do. So I was getting really irate. And when we got back to the car, I was in such a state that I sat in the front of the car, the children in the back, and I sobbed. And then I turned to the children and I said, I made a mistake shouting. But my reason for this is I cannot bear anything to happen to you because I love you so very much. And I wish I had another way of dealing with the frustration of carrying a parcel and not being able to hold the hands of 2 children under 3. And to be honest, if that happened to me again, I'd fucking lob the parcel. But ultimately at that time, I'd got my mum screaming in one ear, I need you to do this. And, you know, I was the only one in the family doing her bidding. So I just thought, oh, fair enough. And I got myself into a mess. But ever since that stage, I've attempted with the children to talk things through and to explain that number one, I'm not perfect and I can make a mistake, because my parents, to a certain degree, led me to believe that they were perfect and they were doing things the correct way. And my mother, right at her death, said to my son, what's wrong with the world now is you don't hit your children enough. And that was her honest opinion, was that if we hit them earlier and for sustained periods, they'd not behave like that.
Yeah, my grandmother used to say, spare the rod and spoil the child. It's exactly the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, thanks for sharing. There isn't much I can add to that. I mean, that's all well put, and I take your point. You know, I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, and it's not always easy. I haven't hit him, and I don't want to. Can I swear I never will? I mean, I hope so, but it's not easy because they do know. In fact, you know, they spend a good while checking where the buttons are, and they make sure they know exactly what they are, and then they know when to press them. And yeah, it's not easy. And it's true that sort of it takes time. You need to sit down, and it takes creativity, and it's easier, I think, as a collective than it is when you're on your own, on your nerves, you know, and it's late, and frankly, they should be in bed, and you have all these other emails to do, whatever, you know. the pressure of the life of a parent is, quite high on your time and on your nerves. It isn't easy. I don't think violence is ever better than the alternative, though. Although I don't want to judge, too quickly, at least, people who do, because I can see, and it's only different times as well, and contexts, and you don't need to go necessarily back in time. You can go from, well, how should I put it? Different ways of life today still around. You could see why people might do it. I still think, non-violence is better. But it's easy to preach it, and I don't think it's fair to judge, or certainly judge quickly, people who commit it. You need to understand first what leads to something before you start telling people off for what they've done. But yeah, I'm just,
Yeah, but I think it's okay. You've got violence on different levels. You're talking about a very personal level now, and we talked about an institutional level before. And well, I think that in one way or another, well, we live in a broken world. We definitely do not live in a perfect world. In Christian terms, dare I say it, we live in a world of sin. And we are all sinners in one way or another. So violence, to me, theologically speaking, is a form of sin, of sinfulness. And I think the great thing about, for instance, the Sermon of the Mount, primarily, is to show us a way out of that, a way to deal with that sinfulness, but still being the very imperfect and sinful persons that we are. It's not always clear cut. So I think, that's what makes the whole thing so complicated.
It does.
Is this any help?
No, I agree, and yes, I didn't clarify what I mean by violence, and of course that's a huge potato that I deliberately tried to ignore. But I mean, there's all sorts of things, and yes, it goes from the personal to the institutional and the structural, and yeah.
If I could say something, I think that if it happens at a personal level, the easiest solution is to try and allow it to sort of pass through you to the institutional level. Like, it's not surprising to me, like, if boys that grew up in these, private schools who are beating each other and getting paddled all the time, then come out and say, when they become prime ministers, say, let's give them a good beating in the Falklands or whatever. And for me, like, I wasn't spared the belt. I was beaten very severely as a child. And, that saying, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, for me, like, I felt with my ex-wife, in the first year of our marriage, I was violent to her because I'm not making excuses, but there was so much violence in my life, and I was in the military as well, that I didn't think a lot about it, to be honest, but my reaction was to be violent. And, she used to slap me, I used to slap her. And it wasn't until I moved into a community, a Christian community, the Mennonites, that one of the Mennonite elders pulled me up on it and said, I saw your wife in the park, she was crying. So this is a bit of a confession. And I want to talk to you about that. And I was in shock that someone knew my secret, but it immediately, I was like found out, and I knew I had to deal with it. So I went to therapy and I worked on it. So it was just like in the very, very early stage of our marriage.
You've just said what you've just said yourself was you knew it was a secret. You said someone found your secret. You already knew it was wrong because you called it a secret.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But for some reason, it was very instinctive. And I think that was conditioning that I had experienced throughout my youth. But I can understand how someone having experienced violence as a child could then think it's okay to punch a Nazi, or it's okay to bomb the Falklanders, or it's okay to hit your partner or whatever. I can understand that. However, I think that, I do think it's sin, and I do think we have to unpack, why we feel that that's okay, and unpack our childhood and look at all that,
Yeah.
Could I say something?
Of course.
Yeah, I've just been listening to what people are saying. It's really interesting. I was just thinking about, I remember reading this thing about Buddhist monks who were going to take the Buddhist message to Mongolia, I think. And up to that point, they'd been vegetarian, but they realized they couldn't live in Mongolia as vegetarians. They'd starve to death. So they decided to put their own accumulation of merit to one side, because they thought taking the Buddhist message was more important, taking the message to the Tibetans was more important than their own personal righteousness or holiness, or however they would phrase it. And I was thinking about the Sikhs, and the Sikhs say that you should never use violence to achieve something, but you can use violence as a means of defending the vulnerable against an aggressor. And in some ways, I think perhaps as a Christian, sometimes there are more important things than our own holiness. So I think sometimes it's possibly better to get dirty defending the weak and vulnerable than it is to be able to say, I've never used force or violence. So for instance, to use Eagle's example, if in a community of ethnic minorities there was going to be some sort of far right attack, I think to physically defend those minorities, even though that might run the risk of using physical violence, I think that your overall objective is valid enough to run the risk of, to use Christian language, using what we've defined as sin, violence. So I think I'd probably position myself nearer to the Sikhs than Tolstoy. But I think we should never use violence as a means of achieving something, but we can sometimes use violence in the defense of the poor and vulnerable against a third-party aggressor.
I completely agree with that, and I think one of the things that has really struck me about one of the criticisms of Tolstoy was that they said that the state, one of the benefits of the state is that it reduces kind of criminal violence against people. Before this current job, I worked in a prison, and that was the most violence by prison guards I've ever seen against people, and also the most violence that I've personally experienced on protests has been from police people to myself. Even more than from the right wing to myself, I've experienced more violence from police officers. I'm not saying any kind of major generalizations about the police, but I think it's important to acknowledge that the state is a huge cause of violence. And when we talk about violence, I don't think the state do protect us against violence. I think the state is actually a huge cause of violence, especially towards vulnerable people. And I think prisons are often a way of hiding people and saying that we're protecting you from these people, whereas actually we're putting these people kind of far away where they're secret, and we're imposing violence upon them, and you just don't see that. So I think it is really important as Christians actually to stand up for those people, because in prisons there's a horrific amount of violence towards prisoners, and they are really vulnerable and they're really oppressed. So yeah, sorry, I just wanted to agree with what you said to me.
Yeah, I too worked in prison for a few years, and so did Rachel, so we have that understand. I agree with you entirely.
On a personal level, I mean, I've took the pacifist stance and had my face rearranged twice by far right.
To explain something.
However, I have to question my own pacifism when it comes to other people. You know, I'm quite prepared to absorb punches. I'm not prepared to let a child absorb punches because of a skin color.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah. Just to add to that, that's one of the reasons why I think you can't judge others for not being non-violent. Sorry, there's too many negatives. But if you subscribe to the kind of views that Tolstoy or similar, I suppose, pacifists subscribe to, then you can try and do it yourself. But you can't accuse others of not living by such a perfect sort of refusal to do violence, because there's all sorts of reasons. We've listed so many from the discussion, from childhood and the way we've been raised, to sort of institutional violence, or to just wanting to help or protect vulnerable people. There's all sorts of reasons why some people might be drawn to violence, but that's, I think, precisely one of the things I like about thinkers such as Tolstoy, because they kind of refuse to dehumanize the person who commits violence. And that's a negative way of saying something more positive, which is to try and understand why it's being done. Not, and even if you still think, there might have been a better way, it's not an easy decision live to sort of have thought of that alternative. So certainly, a compassionate understanding of why some people do it is part of, I think, what Tolstoy invites us to do. If that makes sense.
I think one of the things we all agree on is that non-violence is always the best way. It's always where you go first.
Yeah, but
it's always your plan A. I mean, that using violence would be at most a plan B or a plan C.
How about
somewhere down the line?
How about it wouldn't be part of the plan at all, except that you might act on instinct and be violent. In the Orthodox Church, they have this thing, because they actually don't believe in divorce, but what they believe is that if you do get a divorce, you go through a period of penance where you say, and you both acknowledge like your failures. In the Catholic Church, they say divorce doesn't exist. And so for me, like if I was ever violent, like I'm talking about now, like I haven't been violent for 30 years, but if I was ever violent, I'd have to acknowledge it as sin, and then kind of go to confession and maybe even apologize to the guy I punched in the face. But I might still do it.
I think echoing what Tim said earlier about the sinfulness and the examples from the East, and like Bonhoeffer comes to my mind as someone who recognized the sinfulness of violence, yet considering the failures, not just individually, but the failures of the church situation, there was not a viable alternative that would have, what would you say, like real life effect. So he didn't think he wasn't innocent for being involved in the plot to blow up Hitler. He understood him in a similar way to what you were talking about the Buddhists, Tim, like kind of taking on the sin of the world in some sense. And that's radically different from the self-righteous people who feel completely vindicated in trying to kill people. There's a world of difference in admitting the sinfulness of violence. And I think it is important not to have an individualistic approach. That it's not just about my personal failings that I've become violent, but we as a culture and as a community have, and historically have led ourselves to a place where, like I think Bonhoeffer had some connections with Gandhi, so there's a sort of distant Tolstoyan connection there. But by that point, the Lutheran church and church situation in Germany, like they were so far from being able to activate the life of Christ among them in such a way that it would make a difference. Like, I don't know. And I feel that so much about the church today. Like, yeah, I can understand the individual doing something that's unacceptable because of the collective failures and the difficulty of seeing a hopeful, good solution.
I think the most violent thing we can be is a part of a violent system, so we need to try and to disengage from that.
What do you think that looks like?
Yeah, how would you do that?
Because I love that idea, but I don't know what it looks like.
Yeah.
That's not Not a cynical question.
No.
I just want to make a quick point, and that is that I've read recently that Bonhoeffer was not involved in the plot to assassinate Hitler, but he was aware of the plot to assassinate Hitler. So there's been some like further scholarly work on that, and that he was not directly involved in the plot. But yeah.
I think listening to it all here, it's been very interesting. Obviously, from a baseline of from Jesus' perspective on violence, it's totally unnecessary. And I think it's very dangerous to start thinking, well, violence is wrong unless it's against a fascist, or violence is wrong unless it's against this, that, the other. You have to go in with faith. And you have to go in with faith that what may be a violent situation in our own mind may not turn out to be a violent situation. And also trust God at the moment. Now, I'm not going to say that in the past I haven't been violent. I have. My mother was attacked some years ago. I didn't punch the bloke doing it, but I waited and then pushed him away. There was a bit of push and shove and all that. And in the end, I ended up getting arrested, but nothing came of it. And another incident where I was involved in some violence is a friend of mine with a broken leg was being threatened. So I stood between him and the aggressor. I didn't punch him or anything, but I got shoved hard enough to knock my glasses off my face. Now, what Kyle said earlier, I found very encouraging, because despite my pacifist nature, I've always been of the opinion that World War II needed fighting. And I'm glad somebody now has actually come up and enlightened me about all these other non-violent initiatives that went on. And I can't help thinking now, if the rest of the world had adopted that kind of approach, then Hitler wouldn't have been able to fight a war, because to fight a war, you've got to have something to fight. And I think the mechanisms and their strikes and that would have been in place to cut off all the supply things. So, yeah, I think we have to be careful when we start justifying violence in certain circumstances. But, again, I'm not in anybody's shoes apart from my own, and all I can do is hope and pray that in the next instance of violence that turns up in my life, which it inevitably will, that I have enough faith in God to act correctly. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm worried about the spiral of violence. I'm worried that if you see somebody that's going to attack a child and you somehow attribute this to the divine, like this is how God wants it scenario, that I punch the guy back, that somehow you're feeding into the metaphysics of the spiral of violence, which King warned us about. That if I hit this guy, I don't know if he's going to go back and start beating his wife and kids, and then what have you accomplished? Now, if you put your body in front of him, like Jesus does, like he uses his body, there's a lot of physicality there. And maybe there's creative ways to use your body without being violent.
Yeah, I don't think.
Take the punch or whatever, I don't know.
Yeah.
All right, toilet break.
That's one way to use your body.
Can I ask Alex a question about Tolstoy? I'm curious to know, like my mother and my sister are big on Dostoevsky, who's maybe the only Russian novelist better than Tolstoy. And they always go on about how he was such a great Christian. And he's kind of a safe Christian. He's a very easy, accessible Christian. Yeah. In fact, many non-Christians love him and love his Christianity. And I was just curious to know, oh, Scott, I think you're fine. No, it's not. Okay. Oh, it's my phone. Sorry.
That's his mom.
Actually, that was my sister, the one who's really interested in Dostoevsky. But anyway, okay. I tried to introduce them to Tolstoy, even in a very superficial way. But he's not a safe Christian. He's not a accessible Christian. I mean, he's not someone like Jordan Peterson would like draw on as an example of a good kind of status quo defender. He's like very, like you said, he's very awkward. And I was just curious to know, how would you introduce Tolstoy to a Christian who was not an anarchist, not a pacifist, someone like my mother or my sister? How would you try and like, I'm not saying how to use Tolstoy to brainwash people, but like, how would you kind of give a non-awkward introduction to the things? Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure I can resolve that for you, because so I think it depends on what they might be sympathetic to. I mean, if people aren't sort of ready or willing to be receptive to a set of ideas, then it won't permeate through. But if there are elements of someone's thoughts who they might be sympathetic to, then introducing them to those texts, I suppose, first might trigger an interest in what other things that author might say. I think if you're a fan of Dostoevsky, it's also a style of writing that's quite different to Tolstoy's. So you're probably not gonna be as big a fan of Tolstoy's literature, but if what you're after is getting them hooked, or at least to react to the stuff Tolstoy articulates the last 30 years of his life, then you may as well pick one of the, I suppose, first shorter essays or things that he writes. And there's I don't know, there's millions of them. There's lots of them, and some stuff is sometimes 3-4 pages, some stuff's 50 pages, some stuff's 500 pages. But if they're more likely to be sympathetic to his critique of patriotism, then there's some stuff on that. So it really depends on what they're more likely to find they agree on with Tolstoy first. So me answering it further would depend on what your answer to that be, and then I need to remember what he says in every text. It gets complicated, but yeah. But I can try. I think actually at the end of the book, which I could send, as I said, there's a paragraph where I try and suggest the different themes. You probably want to read that first, so there might be something there.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Thank you.
No, that's all right. Yeah.
Tolstoy the comedian.
I think for me, one of the interesting things about violence, though, is from working in the prison service, what I learned very early on is violence is not only acceptable, it is training for the officers, and it is the expected response from individuals. And the thing is, if you give somebody their expected response, they know how to respond. So if you approach it in a different way, and certainly when I was teaching in the prison, I'll just give you one short example. I had a client who came into one of my classes because I was a teacher in prison, and he basically said he wasn't getting his heart medication, and he'd asked repeatedly on a daily basis for his heart medication. And I was appalled at the fact that his wife may lose her husband and his children may lose their father, because the prison officers are acting like judge and jury. So I went to the office and I wrote him a letter that quoted the part of the European Human Rights Act that they were breaching. And as it's a private prison, I also was party to the information that they get a 10 grand fine off the government for every legal challenge of that nature. So I wrote them a 2-page letter, got him to sign it, take it back. He said they literally ran along the corridor to give him his meds. And it's about being smart.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, even if I had acted violently on his behalf, I would no longer be working there the next day. Yeah. So I'd be no use to him whatsoever. Mm. If I'd have imbued in him the need to be violent, they certainly know how to deal with that. He'd have been down segregation and he'd have had a kicking, and that would have been sweet as. So I just gave him the letter and I said, when they ask where you got it, you say, oh, I did it myself. If my name comes up, I lose my job over this. And I was quite prepared to lose my job because I wasn't prepared for him to lose his life. But I know for certain that if either of us had have acted with violence, it would have backfired massively. But because we didn't, he got his meds. Everybody was happy. I was a bit pissed off, but everybody else was happy. So it's just about a different way, I think, sometimes of thinking. And the fact that the efficacy of violence has to be questioned. Because every situation I've been in when there's violence, at the end of it, all that happens is everyone's got a sore head and black eyes and broken arms. You know, nothing is resolved. The people are still intransigent in their positions of opposition. And I don't think you move people forward. Yeah, I just don't think you move forward. So, but certainly that's my experience of having to twist it and use it in a different way. And I was angry. I was very angry. So it was a 2-page letter instead of half a paragraph. But I made my point. And he didn't have the knowledge to be able to do that. And I couldn't send that letter on his behalf because they wouldn't have acted on it.
I think at risk, like a little theological risk, I've been thinking about what what kind of, what for me, I've just been thinking it's helpful to think about violence or the use of violence in a way, and I'm going to use some words here, and it just maybe sound a little bit crazy, but from a cosmological perspective, you know, I'm going to use the cosmology argument, the ontology argument, and the teleological argument. From a cosmology, like, do we want to live in a world where violence is acceptable? Is it part of God's plan, part of the kingdom? Is this God's cosmology as demonstrated on the Sermon on the Mount? From an ontological perspective, if I can see the other person as my brother, created in the image of God, do I really want to deface the image of God? From a teleological perspective, do I know that me being violent towards another person in the end is going to change him for the better? You know, there's probably other arguments that you can bring forward too, but to use those type of categories of thinking, you know, those are something I can dwell on for a while, and it's part of my thinking. Like I am asking, you know, like, if man is my brother or humans are my brothers and sisters, can I ever justify hitting anyone, even if he can justify it in his own mind?
I mean, I follow your thinking process, but I do come up with a different conclusion at the end of it. Not that I'm violent myself. I'm too bloody old to be violent and disabled. However, I mean, I do think there are times when the only solution is to use violence to protect the least of these.
Well, that's quite common. You know, that's common in Islam. That's common in martial arts, in just war theory. So
it's called the protective use of force. Usually, it's like when a teacher yanks a child off another child who's beating the other one mercilessly. You know, it's like that's protective use of force. It's not. There's no intention to hurt the child, but it is using physical force to stop someone hurting someone. You know.
And is this where we sort of refine what we mean by violence?
Yeah.
Because that I was in a thing in the States a few years ago, and there was this a Mennonite seminary, so non-violence was like taken for granted, and there was this pastor who'd been involved in teaching inner city kids some martial art, because they were daily facing violence. It wasn't like an abstract theory for them. It wasn't conscription high level stuff. It was just daily violence. And he felt the best way to equip them to engage in the world safely and non-violently was to have some physical skills and reflexes that would enable them to minimize force while feeling safe within themselves. And that makes an awful lot of sense to me. Like, it's so much better some kid being equipped to deflect and to hold, to restrain, than feeling like the only thing they can do is carry a knife.
Yeah, I agree.
Or do nothing and not have anything. Just get beaten up.
But it is a fine line, and then it's that could easily become the thin end of the wedge, and I don't know. You don't want to get pedantic about it.
Because I studied martial arts for many years, but normally you're taught never to use it, and if you are using it, you're using the most minimal amount possible.
Yeah.
Or you're using it to disarm someone or to deflect someone, like you said. But like striking someone is not, that's like quite taboo. and it's not part of the system. It's not part of what the sensei is going to be telling you to do, really. You're preparing your body for it. But I think in the same way, like Martin Luther King taught his followers to prepare their body for nonviolence. You know, they used to stand across from each other and slap each other in the face and spit at each other and say, if you can't handle this nonviolence, do not march with us. Yeah. And Kyle knows a bit more about that, but
no, because I think when you're standing up to the state, if you use violence against the state, you're playing the exact game the state wants you to play. States are built on violence, all of them. Adam Smith observed this when he spoke about the need for a civil law to protect the rich from invasion of their possessions. And if you try and play that game, especially with fascist states, I think if you do it against fascist states, Because for fascists, violence is not about just getting resources, like getting money or getting property or getting land. For fascists, violence is about purification. It's a much more metaphysical idea, and it's about forging a national group. And you're playing I don't want to offend, I know Chloe's, I think, a part of Antifa or sympathetic to Antifa. I don't want to offend anybody sympathetic to Antifa, because I quite like some of their ideas as well. But they're playing the exact game. When they go and they punch fascists in the face, they're doing the exact thing that fascists want them to do.
I think you're wrong on that.
Really, you think so? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think violence against the state is ridiculous. It doesn't achieve anything. When fascists are fought, like on Cable Street or with Antifa, there are positive results.
Okay, I'm not saying violence is never ineffective. I think, I think Alex pointed out the study done by Erica Chenoweth. The statistic I remember is that in the last 100 years, of like hundreds of revolutions and insurrections studied, the violent ones work about 25% of the time, and the non-violent ones work about 50% of the time. So both of them have quite a low success rate, actually. It's very difficult to stand up to a state. But the point I was just saying was that with fascists, I'm not saying it's never effective, but I'm just saying you're playing the game they want you to play. You're much more likely to be like. I'll say another thing as well. You mentioned that you're old and disabled, and that's a very good reason not to support violence against anything, fascism, and so on. The great thing about nonviolent action, I think Tolstoy would have appreciated this as an old man as well, was that old people can take part, women can take part, disabled people can take part, children can take part. I mean, Martin Luther King tried to use all of those groups when he was marching. You can't do that with violence. Generally speaking, it's only really young men who can take part in that in a successful way. And so I do think that you're right, that violence can work, but it's a question of what's more effective, not what's effective and not effective, but what's more effective.
But I think it's, you know, I mean, these studies are great, but they're very broad. You know, I think when you're talking about anti-fascist action on people, there's a specific situations, and their story is never told. So they're seldom bought into those statistics.
I'll give you a story never told you might be interested in. Cable Street is a story that British left constantly tells itself when it's trying to justify Antifa and so on. But a story they don't talk about is another country, Norway. When Norway resisted Hitler using nonviolent action, they successfully stopped Hitler taking over the education system in Norway. And they used nonviolent means to do that. They used boycotts, they used marches, they used symbols on their clothing. And it took sacrifice. A few people did die, but they managed to stop that happening, the Nazification of the teachers' union in Norway. No one talks about that story. I feel like a lot of the time we raise up the stories that we want to hear, and we don't. I'm not saying you're doing this by any chance, Gary. Yeah.
Kyle, you made a distinction earlier about using violence against the state, and maybe there's a difference in the situation. Like, that's an interesting nuance, I guess, that I've not probably reflected on much before. But there's tactical things. You know, it's like if you're going to study military strategy, you're not going to universally say, well, this is the tactic to use in all situations. That's absurd. So in the sort of struggle for prominence or dominance or control of the streets, it's a different thing than dealing with a fascist state that's got hegemony in your area. And I think that's, I don't know what I'm saying really, but yeah, that's
no, but these are different scenarios. I think I take your point. I think because it's one thing to sort of work out how you react in Norway as members of the teachers' union now that you've been invaded by Hitler. It's fascists, and it's fascists when it's fascists in the street, and the kinds of examples that Eagle had. But it's a very different kind of scenario. These are thugs about to beat people up down this street type thing. It's not the same scenario, but I certainly, even if you are to sort of use violence, it's not on its own the solution. It doesn't resolve the fact that people were drawn to these fascist ideas and sort of coming on the street to beat people up. There's a lot more that can be done in terms of thinking about what else can prevent that scenario in the first place. Firstly, and secondly, I think one of the things who mentioned it or made me think of it, was it Scott? It's kind of how you get to remember this, and this speaks to something else that has been mentioned. I mean, we tend to speak about acts of violence in our history because they're the spectacular stuff that we've reported, that drew attention at the time, that we're talking that therefore have lived on in memory. It's much harder to report on non-violence because often it's kind of an non-action, or unless you play with the theatrics of violence by having the violence inflicted upon you in a way that's quite outrageous and unjust, and it might get reported. But in general, it doesn't get reported as much as violence. And to me that also, so see, if I'm thinking about the Second World War, the thing about it, maybe it was a worthy war to some extent, fighting Hitler back, but it's kind of how you remember it since as a result. So I'm working on a paper at the moment, which is kind of a pacifist critique of poppy commemorations. That's another big one. It's interesting when you look at the history of the poppy that the remembering that happened in the interwar years was a kind of remembering full of grief. It wasn't a good war that we fought in the First World War. It was frankly a shit war. We would have all rather not have to fight. No one was particularly moral in that war. It was a mess, and there was a lot of blood on the floor as a result. The Second World War, because it was much more easily sold as legitimate, and arguably so. I mean, prevented the ongoing Holocaust. Hitler had nasty plans, whatever. Allows us to remember all the wars that British soldiers have fought, and as good wars for freedom, and we remember the Hitler bit, we don't remember the trenches, we don't remember the anti-colonial wars or Malaya, we remember therefore it's interesting that once you do have acts of violence, and here I'm speaking about the particular theatrical ones, I suppose you could talk about cable shoot and so on, you remember them as moments of victory, you remember them as moments of glory, which can easily then be captured by all sorts of political interests that aren't as ambivalent about having had to use violence in the first place, and that commemorate the us that committed the violence against them in a way that apparently resolved it, forgetting all the other things that might have helped resolve that in the longer run. So if it's about the Second World War, it's all the work that went on, I mean, from the resistance during the war to the way Europe was kind of constructed for all its ills as well afterwards. If it's about fighting fascists in the streets, it's again all the work that was done, engaging with disgruntled communities. We just remember the violence bit, and so I think even if therefore we concede to sort of using tactics that may be violent, and I don't just mean interposing your body, I mean punching and hurting people. I don't think it's violence to sort of have your glasses broken. It's violence upon you at worst, but you're not committing violence if you're putting your body in the line. It's not. I don't think that's a different. But it's that even if we sort of accept that we have to use violence in a situation, we do so genuinely, reluctantly, genuinely aware of all the consequences, the implications in the way it's going to be remembered, in the way it's going to be reported, in the risk of a spiral of violence, in the way it occludes every other effort. All of that. I think it's Simone de Beauvoir who talks about that when it talks about you remember if you do concede to using violence or go down as Plan G or something, that you don't forget all these other things. About the violence that you're committing, and yet that's the very sort of stuff that as a society we don't usually remember when we remember those acts. Sorry, bit of a rant, but I hope
that's the teleological argument.
Perhaps, yes. Cosmological too, I think. It's how you get to remember things, but yeah. But yeah.
Tolstoy had the luxury of living at a very peaceful time in Europe. Is that right? I mean, there wasn't World War II happening, or
I mean,
there was colonization. There was war against colonies that were disobedient. But as far as I know, Europe was very peaceful. So in a way, he kind of had the luxury of not having to, be more. He didn't have to be more nuanced. He actually could be quite absolutist, couldn't he?
I mean, yes and no. So I know what you mean, and I kind of agree. But he did fight in Crimea and Sevastopol, and that was ugly.
That was a terrible war. Yeah.
He fought, did he fight? He certainly was involved in Chechnya, basically in pacifying the locals. in his earlier years.
Liberating Chechnya from.
Yeah. And that, so all that is in what, the 1850s. So before he, converts, I suppose, to his Christian anarchist understanding later on. But also when, in those last 30 years, the Russo-Japanese War does happen. France and Germany, 1870s was before that, but the repercussions of it were still being talked about, and the alliance between, was it France and Russia, which was celebrated as an act of peace, which of course everyone knew was bullshit. They said it, it was pretty clear in the commentary, it was an alliance against Germany because France wanted Alsace-Lorraine back, etc. So, he was aware of, there was a lot of that, and there was, of course, he does live through 1905, the failed revolution in Russia and the escalation of violence. So in terms of domestic turmoil, he sees a fair bit of it. Now, that said, he sees all of that from the comfort of Yasnaya Polyana, his country estate. So he doesn't experience violence really directly himself, certainly grant that. He doesn't live through 1917 in Russia or the Second World War, but there is violence around, and the Boer Wars he comments on as well. So it's not completely. So yes and no. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying. I was going to ask you. Sorry, one quick question. Little question. I had the supposition that Tolstoy was a philosophical anarchist who didn't really, who kind of was actually against revolution and didn't really believe. He basically said that you should try and change yourself, not change the world. And I had that idea until I started listening to what you just said now, and I think it completely changed my mind on it. And I was going to ask you if you had any experiences like that yourself when you started writing and researching Tolstoy. Did you have lots of ideas about him which were completely changed and transformed as he wrote?
Oh, yeah. So I don't know. The more you dig into, I think, the more detail you uncover about what he may have thought, and there might have been incoherences as well, or their thinking might have shifted. I think, when I got hooked onto Tolstoy, I quickly basically gobbled up as much as I could because I was doing a PhD at the time, and it was justified, and it means that there wasn't kind of a long period of having just read one bit and perhaps a bit that was perhaps not the best representation of the whole thought that he stands for. So. But I also quickly came across these kinds of views, which you're not the only one to hold. That he seems to be preaching a changing of yourself only. The point is, as I tried to make before, hopefully you picked up on it. You change the world by changing yourself, and hoping that changes, that encourages others to do the same. He absolutely wants the world changed. He thinks the world is sick and problematic and violent, etc. So he does want that changed. The question is the how, and for him, and you do that kind of inside out. You start with yourself and hope that others pick up on that too. As for categories like philosophical anarchist, it was a common term at the time, and it's been used since, well, less so now, I think. And it's not a term I particularly like necessarily, because it kind of boxes, I don't know, it kind of ascribes to a whole bunch of people kind of the assumption that they're mostly just philosophical when
armchairs.
Yeah. But I know that's not what you meant to do, but yeah. So, I think with Tolstoy, maybe quickly enough came to the view that kind of became kind of self-reinforcing, that in a sense so one of the interesting things, if I can just say that as well, and then I'll shut up, I think he's often misread in a number of ways. And one of them is that people will sometimes say, oh, very mystical Christianity, or, he was, I think people kind of often misread the way he reads Christianity. That's why I kind of started by saying what I said about the way he uses Christian vocabulary. He's an awkward Christian. He's not. Is he a Christian? I don't necessarily want to, settle that. But I think once things clicked for me, once I got to the understanding I suppose I currently have, which might be proven wrong, I might change my mind. I'm always open to changing my mind. But which is that. That he uses that vocabulary with a rationalistic and deistic frame of mind himself, and he uses it. He genuinely believes he's using it correctly, in fact. But if we, see when he talks of revelation, if we read it with what we have in mind as revelation, I think we misread him. Maybe he does that deliberately, by the way. But what he means isn't necessarily what we understand. If you see what I'm saying, because for him the main mission is conveying what he wants to convey about violence. And yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense.
I think one of the other ways of understanding Tolstoy is looking at other stuff he did. I mean, he did assist Kropotkin to get Kropotkin's books out.
Yeah,
you know, which for me places him in that a little bit in that mold of anarchism.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Solidarity, etc. And yeah, I mean, yeah, yes, I suppose the main activism, if it's a word, that he does, apart from, I suppose, trying to live up to some of his ideals in, being a vegetarian, working the land, and sort of trying to dissociate himself from the wealth that he had inherited and was enjoying, sort of. Apart from that, the personal example stuff, the main stuff he does is publish and carry on publishing and publishing abroad and helping others get published, to get to your point. He knows that's effective. People tell him to carry on writing and publishing because it's getting picked up and it's kind of working. But that's more or less all he doesn't join in marches. He doesn't do the kind of stuff Gandhi does. But it's mainly his own personal example, and to the extent it's picked up, and publishing and helping others get published. And yes, he was very sympathetic to Kropotkin, and that was mutual, I think, although he rarely speaks of it directly. Kropotkin has written about Tolstoy because he survives him, and he praises the bits of him that he likes later on. And yes, Tolstoy helped, and through, if not him directly, at least some of the sort of outlets that are set up to publish Tolstoy by people Tolstoy knew, some of his associates and friends and Tolstoyans, also help publish work by Kropotkin and others as well, in England in particular, by the way.
I ask about the practicalities of his community life, or like you talked about, like the disassociating himself from his inherited wealth, and like when you're an aristocrat trying to set up an anarchist commune, like that sounds quite a sort of paradoxical endeavor. So
he doesn't set up a commune himself, and he's aware. So I mean, the scholar on this is Charlotte Alston, Northumbria. She's written a great book on Tolstoyans at the turn of the century, and really, what she shows, I think, quite well is that it's in the late 1890s that there is an increasing buzz, and there are more and more people who describe themselves as Tolstoyans, who kind of convert, if you want, to Tolstoyanism, if that's a thing, and who try and set off and enact certain aspects of what Tolstoy preaches. And some go off into communities and so on. And he's aware of that because he's alive at the time, and he himself says, he's not a Tolstoyan. He doesn't think there's such a thing as Tolstoyans. There's the truth, which he subscribes to and explains, and that's what people ask. That's classic Tolstoy. But he also, I think, is ambivalent about communities that, to go back to your earlier, I think, challenge to Eagle to some extent, the kind of how do we do this? I think Tolstoy isn't particularly keen on communities that withdraw entirely from the world and disconnect completely. I mean, he still wants people to disconnect, and he does as much as possible from all sorts of things, but it needs to be visible, it needs to be seen, otherwise it's not going to spread, is it? So he's not necessarily keen on communities going off and basically disappearing off grid and not being noticed at all. And he's also, he also doesn't, different thing here, but he doesn't, he's not practical. He doesn't tell people how to live in a community. And in fact, trying to live by what he preaches in a community proved pretty challenging, to put it mildly and euphemistically, in most of the communities that tried to. They basically almost all collapsed. A few sort of survived on, but transformed really, and weren't necessarily subscribed to all the key Tolstoyan sort of dogmas, if you will. Because what he preaches is quite absolutist and not very practical. And apart from the grand sort of ideal of, I suppose, working the land and being non-violent, but that, what do you do when your neighbors come and take the cows away? Which is I think it's one of the ways one of the scholars put it, commenting on is it the Dutch communities, or I can't remember, that were Tolstoyan at the time. So there were Tolstoyan communities. He was sympathetic, and at the start he kind of encouraged them, but basically he then dissociated himself from them, and he certainly was suspicious of withdrawals from society. But what he preaches doesn't really tell us much about how to live in such communities and isn't particularly helpful for that. So, but what he does in Jasnaya Poljana is different, and you know, he's a count originally. He inherits that land, but he's uneasy about it. And a lot of the tensions, frankly, that there are between him and his wife, and therefore parts of his family, some are on his side, few more on the white side, are to do with precisely the fact that he wanted to get rid of as much of that as possible. And they were saying, well, you know, we kind of were hoping to sort of live on it. And that leads to a lot of the tensions around the royalties and the estate, etc. And you know, to the point that when he runs away and basically dies as he runs away, he's running away from another argument he had with his wife about his royalties. So he was well aware of the fact that he was still living a comfortable life, and yet I suppose he tried. That said, to finish on that side of the ambivalence, you know, people still cooked for him, his wife mainly. You know, he might, and the fact that he wanted to be a vegetarian meant that his wife had to cook 2 meals for the evening, one for everyone and one for him. You know, so you know, he doesn't exactly live up to all the aspects of what he preaches, if I may put it that way, I suppose. But yeah, so it's a complicated story around that, but I think an interesting one nonetheless.
Can I ask, I've heard that he was quite anti-feminist. Could you speak about that idea? I heard he's actually quite against feminism.
I like the quick by the by before we finish question. I mean, it's a big one.
He might have had to cook his own dinner.
You know, it wouldn't have hurt him.
Neither have Gandhi, for that matter.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. The cop-out preface, I'll say, is I address that in the book. So, but he so. What complicates things is his view on marriage. I don't know if I can expand on that here. I mean, but in real short, he thinks marriage isn't something to be sanctioned by the church. Marriage is what happens when you're in a couple, and we should only marry once, so only one partner ever. That's your wife, or in the case of the man, and he's speaking as a man, and he certainly is speaking as a man. And you are not to be adulterous even in the mind. And so it's that kind of ascetic, pretty high ideal, you know. So, and he evolves from early after his conversion, preaching marriage and you know, having kids. And by the way, the wife is the child bearer and rearer, and there's absolutely that. So very much not a feminist. He moves from that to a kind of preaching complete celibacy as he evolves, and that's what you get with, I suppose, by the time he writes Kreutzer Sonata. So that's one thing in the background. Now, separately to that, he's aware of the feminist movement and feminist comrades at the time in Russia. There are debates, there are various things that hit the news, and his view there is sort of ambivalent. I think the main reason he says he doesn't prioritize feminist or has much time for it is he thinks it's the wrong priority. So you know the way in which today some people might say, never mind issues like LGBT rights, for example, the priority should be socioeconomic exploitation, class. It's about class. It's not all the other stuff. People who say, I'm not saying that's what I'm saying, but the same way he would say, it's not about the feminism and the whatever, it's the violence that matters. This is the thing that matters. It's not all that. And worrying about all that means that we worry about that instead of the thing that matters. And so I think he was sympathetic, and certainly he says somewhere that, you know, he certainly thinks that all human beings are equal. So he certainly thinks of all human beings, men and women, of equal worth. But he still, I think, quite clearly subscribes to the kind of division of labor between men and women, which he himself enjoyed, which is, of course, deeply problematic. So he's not comfortable to approach with feminist questions in mind. So yeah, but that's unpacked a bit more in the book, which I can share.
Thank you.
All right. Are we exhausted? Or...
I was just thinking, we've done 2 hours of recording.
It's the silence of exhaustion.
Oh boy.
Which is quite a long time, and some of us were on half an hour longer than that as well. So.
I lost Chloe again.
I hope that.
Can we assume that you're okay to put this this time on the website on the Facebook page?
I'm fine with it as long as everyone else is with what they've said.
Well, I did do my hair.
I'll put it on YouTube.
My mother-in-law was warned. She almost wanted to put a frame on. I said, that's ridiculous. Just we're fine.
Yeah, I was going to do a quiz afterwards, but I think we've been on for a long time. I don't think anyone's going to want to do it. We can do it another time for another event. So maybe a fun place.
Thank you so much. And I wish it could have been in person, but I'm so glad that, especially for you, Ange, as well, for kind of saying, hey, we can do this, and getting on with it, doing it. So
thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Alex.
And thanks, Alex, for breaking into your holiday as well.
It's fine, and I think it was a great discussion as well. I'm not really on holiday. I'm half. Anyway, yeah, but pleasure.
Right, on that note, then, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And Chloe has sent me a message that her computer crashed again, like yesterday. So I shall say farewell and thank you all, and it will be eventually on YouTube when I've downloaded it or uploaded it.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye, guys.
Lovely to see you all.
Lovely to see you all, even when it's only on screen.